Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talking Around the Library Tree, which is the podcast from Lancaster University Library. Today, I'm delighted to be talking about one of our special collections that we have in the archives here at Lancaster. It's called the Patten Collection. So Peter Patten was a man who lived in Penwortham, and he collected paper ephemera, which was published in the Second World War era. He amassed a collection of more than 1,000 leaflets, booklets, and other paper items, which were donated to the university in the late 1980s, we believe. The collection consisted of materials covering a broad range of topics from the wartime era, mostly published by the British government. This could be things about cooking and preserving food, ration advice, air raid precaution booklets. But other documents include things around military organisations such as the Royal Air Force, the Home Guard, and there are several propaganda documents about the Germans, Soviets and other nations' military organisations, and a small number of books written in the German language. It really is a fascinating collection, and you can find it on our website on one search. If you do a search on Patten Collection, it will bring that up. There's also theatre programmes, comedy and music publications, which give a real insight into people's social and leisure interests of the time, which makes this a really, unique collection, particularly in the fact that a lot of these documents probably wouldn't have been preserved by organisations at the time that Peter was collecting them. So a lot of these will have been lost to time apart from this really unique and wonderful collection. So I'm delighted to be able to talk about that today. And I'm even further delighted to be joined by Peter's son, Jim. So thank you for joining us, Jim, and welcome.
Absolute pleasure, Andy. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much. So let's start with talking about your dad and his early years, really. So if he was born in 1928, he's going to be, roughly around about 11 when war broke out, do you think?
Yeah, he was, absolutely. He was born in Leeds in 1928, so obviously would have been 11 when the war broke out, but 17 when it finished. So I think the war came, obviously, absolutely in his formative years, really. So I think that's probably one reason it made such a massive impression on him later life, really.
Yeah. So obviously, that kind of age and living in a city, did he get evacuated? Do you know if he was where he was evacuated to? Or
I think from memory, when the war broke out, he was evacuated to a place called Spalding in Lincolnshire, which I think is a little village in this kind of tulip growing area of Lincolnshire. But I think that might have been during what was called the Phony War, wasn't it? From September 1939 until the middle of the following year. And I think when they realised that nothing much was going to happen for a few months, I think it was sent back to Leeds.
Right, okay.
At that stage. But then a couple of years later in 1941, once the Blitz had started, my granddad, my dad's dad, worked for a government ministry. Not too sure what that was, although he later on dealt with Polish refugees.
Okay.
And the ministry was evacuated en bloc to Southport. So when my dad was, say, 13, he was evacuated from Leeds to Southport. I think initially to his immense chagrin, because he was a proud Yorkshireman, unfortunately. And I've lived in Lancashire all my life, but it was forced to move to Southport. In fact, I think he actually escaped back to Leeds on the train on a couple of occasions. But I think he did grow to enjoy living in Southport in the end. That was where they lived for the rest of my grandparents' life, where their dad spent the rest of his teenage years,
more years. Yeah, and hence the connection. Yes, Penwortham as well, because Southport's just growth. Penwortham.
Yeah, we eventually moved to Penwortham, which, as you probably know, is a suburb of Preston.
Yeah. And for any listeners that aren't aware, go on Google and look up War with the Roses, because Yorkshire, Lancashire, or you could just watch the latest Wallace and Gromit film, which really references the fact that Yorkshire and Lancashire are two divided nations with law. So that's an interesting thing. Did he have any siblings or anything like that were evacuated with him? Or
he had a couple of younger brothers. One of my Uncle Brian eventually emigrated to Canada not long after the war. And he had a brother James as well, who was about 8 to 10 years younger.
Interesting. Did they ever develop any collecting things that you know about?
Not as far as I know.
No, so there's no other Patten archives out there that we.
There's not, although his youngest brother James was a slightly famous composer in later life, a kind of modern composer.
Yeah.
So I don't think he collected anything.
Okay, fair enough. So that gets us into the collection. So, do you know when he started and what was the spark, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I was born in the 1960s, 1963. And throughout my childhood, it was kind of constant presence. I'm guessing he probably started collecting it in the 60s and carried on into the 1970s. But it's difficult to say with any certitude.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of, obviously, in the 1960s, the war was relatively recent, really. I think when you get to that 20, 30 years after an era, when you're an adult, you kind of develop a bit of a nostalgia for that era, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, 30 years now since the 1990s. I was like 30 odd. You look back on that whole era. First of all, it seems very recent, you know.
It's scary, isn't it?
It is, and Britpop and Oasis and Tony Blair and all this kind of thing, and Friends on television.
Yep.
Believe it or not, it's 30 years old, isn't it? When you look back on now, you look back on it with a sense of nostalgia, but it also does seem very recent as well. So I'm guessing it was probably settled in Ben with him and moved from 1967. That he probably started collecting then, I guess. He carried on into the 1970s.
Yeah. How aware were you of that collecting then when child then? Did he have things around the house, or did he have things framed on walls, or was your mum like, no, you can keep it in the loft and when you're coming out over the dinner table or anything like that?
I'm not sure how much interest my mum took in it, to be honest. And I think it was actually kept in the loft. Although we did have a boarded up loft, so I think it was probably kept fairly well. It was a kind of constant background presence in the house, I think, when I was growing up. Well, I've got to say, I've spoken to my sister, who was 3 years younger than me, about this recently. And she only had a very, very sketchy recollection at all. Right? Maybe that's just excitable interest in it. But I definitely remember him showing us things lying around the house, like spread out on the floor, archived in the loft. But like I said before, it's the best part of 1,000 pieces of stuff. So it must have taken up a lot of room. We didn't have a massive house. It was kind of a 3-bedroom house, so that's the reason it was loft.
Yeah, and I suppose that realistically, practicalities, paper leaflets and things don't take up a huge area of, it's not like he's collecting, physical items at different shapes and stuff. So he could file them away quite well. So I guess that's quite a good thing, really. So I mean, in terms of his collection and he built up all this stuff and he's collected it over many years, where did he find it? How did he source this kind of stuff?
It's a good question, that, isn't it? I mean, obviously there was no internet those days, so you couldn't buy stuff on eBay. I do remember my mother going to what I think must have been trade fairs.
Right.
So I'm guessing there were either trade fairs specifically for this kind of material, or general trade fairs of printed material, bryetics fairs. So you must be able to get the stuff from that kind of thing. Might have been advertised in magazines, maybe, I guess. Specialist magazines. So I think he must have collected it in that way. I don't know how much of a collector's market there would have been for it in those days. I'm guessing there probably would have been quite a few people interested in collecting stuff for the same reason. But it's in the nature of printed material, isn't it, that in 20 years, a lot of it would have been destroyed or thrown away immediately after the war or even during the war. And a lot of it would have been lost or destroyed in 20, 30 years subsequent to that. I suppose as people have died, the kids have found the stuff in the house, they probably would have just chucked it out. It's the supply of this stuff must have been diminishing rapidly over the years, really. But like I say, I think there must have been some kind of a collector's market for it.
I would imagine so. Obviously, there certainly is these days for World War II memorabilia and things like that. So I'm presuming there would have been then. And I know from my family experience, I'm from a family of collectors, not this type of thing, but I collected all the programs out back to the 1930s or so, and I used to go around different fairs, and I do remember seeing stalls of military things. So I did wonder whether that was kind of your answer. So I understand that completely. One of the things that's quite interesting, it says in the archive and the notes we have on your dad that he worked in printing. He went to work for the Cambridge University Press. Is that right? Was that always his career then? Did he do that from school onwards? And do you think that might have played a part in him looking at ephemera and things like that?
Yeah, possibly. It wasn't a printer. He was employed by Cambridge University Press as, I think the title was educational rep. So his job really was, he was going around to schools, essentially selling school textbooks.
Yeah.
So I think it was probably, well, it was obviously in the era preceding the national curriculum, when I'm guessing every school had a bit of autonomy in terms of what courses they used to take up. So I think Cambridge University Press, from memory, the big thing was mathematics textbooks.
Okay.
So they had something called school mathematics projects. That's what they were pushing in the late 60s, early 70s when I remember that. So that was his main job. I think before that, maybe in his 20s, he certainly went to work for the Cambridge University Press in the 1950s, when he was already probably best part of 30.
Okay.
I think he very briefly worked as a teacher in some kind of small private school in Southport, and maybe had one or two other similar jobs.
Yeah.
But he worked for Cambridge University Press until he retired. Then he briefly worked for the University of Central Lancashire, working with kids in schools from memory. But his main job for 30 years was the press. So yeah, that could have stimulated his interest in the collection.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So obviously he's got this huge collection, 1,000 items, and we've got some of them in the rooms today. Plans, other plates, and other things from governments and things like that. Did he ever say he had a favourite piece, or was there anything that you know of that he kind of cherished more than anything else, or one that was particularly hard to find and he had that like eureka moment when he found it? Or
I'm not too sure about individual items or how valuable they were, or even how much paid for. But it can't have been much. Yep. Because obviously to accumulate the best part of 1,000 items, you can't have been paying hundreds of pounds each, obviously. It's that well off. I suspect his interest mainly was in the military side of it. So I think the things which are kind of aircraft identification, air raid, to build your own air raid shelter and that kind of thing was probably his main interest. The war definitely made a big impression on him. So although Southport was a little bit out of the way in terms of military action, which was obviously why that ministry our granddad worked for was evacuated there, he was still pretty close to the war. It was all must have been all pervasive for the 6 years, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But I remember him saying there was a German plane crashed on Southport Beach.
Yeah.
The crew killed, I think. I remember him saying he used to go to school in Crosby.
That's what my wife.
Was it right? If I believe it or not, he actually told me once he used to walk every day from Southport to Crosby to go to school.
Yeah.
And back.
That's impressive.
Which is some feat, isn't it?
About 10 or 12 miles per year.
Absolutely. Yeah, that must be pretty fit. But I remember him saying that some kid he knew actually wandered onto Crosby Beach through the Beware of Mines sign and literally got blown to pieces.
Yeah.
So I mean, these things did happen. I actually remember my mother saying that I think her father, who lived near them, actually had a revolver, which he'd probably kept from the First World War. And he'd said he was keeping it to basically shoot the family in case the Germans ever invaded, to prevent particularly the women.
There was a lot of that probably.
There was, yeah.
Yeah.
Prevent the women folk especially falling into German hands. So it was kind of an unimaginable period, I think it was now. But I think it was that military side of it that's particularly attracting my dad's attention.
Yeah. So was his dad was he in active service in the war then, or do you think that maybe had an influence on it?
I think my granddad was, on my dad's side, fell into that very small category of people who were too young for the First World War. I think he was drafted into the Navy right at the end of the First World War, but I'm not so sure whether he actually even got on a ship before he was demobbed in 1890. And by the time of the Second World War, he must have been in his late 30s or possibly even over 40. So I don't think he was ever conscripted. And as I say, the other factor is I suspect he might have been in a protected occupation working for the government ministry.
Yeah.
So he didn't serve. And Mum's dad served in Burma. Okay, fighting the Japanese. It's no allergies.
Good. So we touched on his early life. We touched on his collecting and things like that. Bringing it back up to kind of the here and now. There's a really interesting story about your son and this collection. So would you like to share that with our listeners, please?
Yeah, I mean, this whole thing is it's a long story, and it's almost a little bit of an embarrassing story, really, because my dad disposed of the collection from memory. It must have been the mid-1980s, because they sold the family home after I'd gone to university and later got a job in 1988, and I'm sure they disposed of it by then. And I think it was just a question, really, of the collection had grown so large that he didn't want to sell it all off and disperse it. He wanted it to go to a good home, so to speak, which is probably why he decided to donate it to the university. I think possibly he might well have known one or two of the lecturers at the university through his job.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I can think of. In fact,
That stands to reason, given in textbooks and things. Yeah.
So maybe that's why he thought of Lancaster University first of all, though obviously it is the nearest major educational institution to Preston anyway, so that's possibly the reason. I do remember him talking about, there was a university lecturer called Norman Sherry. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. I don't know. No. He wrote a very big, definitive biography of Graham Greene.
Okay.
A big 3-volume, 3,000 word a biography of Graham Greene. I do remember my dad talking about coming up to visit Norman Sherry at the university at Big. It's quite an amusing story, actually. He said once that they had to lock themselves in Norman's office while a student riot took place outside, drinking sherry, ironically enough. I think even universities, even in the 1970s, were very different, more violent places than
Yes, there's been a few student protests over the years.
than they are these days. Students seem a lot more compliant these days, rightly or wrongly. But I suspect that might have been why he disposed of it to Lancaster University. But I must admit, I wouldn't say I'd completely forgotten about the collection, but I very rarely thought of it over the years.
Yeah.
And obviously my son Tom has come to study history and politics here. He's just finishing the end of 3 years this summer, so it's been here the best part of 3 years. And I still hadn't really put two and two together until about 6 months ago. This collection, for some reason, just popped into my mind. And I kind of thought, when I thought about it, I thought, hang on, did he actually donate it to Lancaster University? So like I say, it's a bit embarrassing, really. I've never made the connection before.
Like you say, it's 50 odd years ago, isn't
It is, yeah, absolutely. So at that stage, I thought, well, if he did, it'll long since have consigned to a skip, or it'll, at best case scenario, it'll be festering away in the library basement. But what I did is I Googled Lancaster University Second World War memorabilia, right? And I was absolutely astonished. The first thing that comes up on the internet is the Patten Collection. Brilliant. So like I said, I mean, he could really knock me down with a feather at that stage.
Yeah.
When I realised not only had it not been consigned to a skip, but it obviously been very well looked after and seemed to be a fairly major part of the university archives. To the extent that when I mentioned it to Tom, when I saw it about 10 days later, driving to watch North End play Leeds, ironically, as soon as I mentioned it, he kind of said, hang on, is that the Patten Collection? And he knew all about it.
Okay, wow.
So from that point, I realised that it was a fairly major thing. And he then got in touch with Liz and Katie in the archives. And
Yeah.
they very kindly invited us all over to eclipse the life and Tom's girlfriend, Holly, to look through a selection of the stuff, which was very much appreciated.
Brilliant. What a fantastic story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I say, I wouldn't say I'd completely forgotten about it, but it had just been in the back of my mind for 30 years, really.
Yeah. So obviously you were invited back to come and have a look at this by Katie and Liz. I mean, did seeing any of it again trigger any memories, or was it just kind of, oh yeah, this is interesting, this is my dad's stuff, I remember this, but there wasn't anything specific triggered by that? Or
I don't think there was anything specific, but it all looked very, very familiar.
Yeah.
Obviously, with being nearly 1,000 items, it's difficult to remember individual stuff, but certainly like I said, the actual military stuff, the aircraft identification posters and that kind of thing, and what to do in an air raid, that was very familiar. Stuff relating to cookery, how to feed your family on a cabbage and turnip and that kind of thing for a week. Again, I definitely recognised that.
Yeah.
When we were kindly taken down to the actual archive itself to look at the rest of the sock stuff and see how it was stored. There's a lot of newspapers in there, which I don't remember at all, really. In fact, I think the archive staff are still going through those and actually classifying them. Don't remember those being collected. The books, I don't really remember looking through either. There do seem to be quite a lot of books in there as well. But it just generally looked very familiar, the style of it and that kind of thing. Yeah, so it definitely brought back a lot of memories.
That's good. So, I mean, a couple of questions to wrap this up. So obviously your dad's collection's here, it's been well looked after, the archive staff are doing some good stuff with it and sharing it with more students for future generations to come. That must be a good feeling, knowing that all his hard work and all his dedication is going to be shared with generations to come.
It is. I mean, we've just gone past the 20th anniversary of his passing, actually. My mother died 5 years ago as well. So it's great to think, really, that it's gone to a good home and that students are actively using it. It is a good thing, really. Yeah, it's a little bit of a family legacy living on. Obviously, Tom, having been here, doing history as well, that just kind of adds to the story, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, it obviously runs through the family, doesn't it? So final question, a bit of a fun question, really. After he donated this collection, did he collect anything else, or did your mum go, no, we've got rid of one, we're not having any more?
It's a good question, actually. Well, she wouldn't have said that because they actually split up not long after.
Okay.
So he could do what he wanted after that, but I don't think so. I think he actually lived a bit of a minimalist, almost Spartan life after that stage. He moved to a cottage in Longton, so that wasn't really cluttered up with stuff from that point. So I think after amassing this collection, which must have been quite an effort, he probably thought that was enough.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's good to know. So anyway, Jim, thank you very much for your time today. It's been fascinating to talk to you. And this is just a wonderful collection. So if you want to explore this further, please look on the University Library website, search for Patten Collection, and you'll see links to some of the wonderful things that you can come and explore in the archive here at Lancaster. So thank you for listening. Thank you very much, Jim. And listening to the next podcast when it arrives. Cheers, guys.
Thanks, Andy.